A dead winemaker left his children one final riddle. 6 bottles in an old wine cellar, 1 inheritance, 1 poison choice. Everyone blamed the wine. Edward Hale blamed the cork.
Prologue, the cellar riddle. The old winemaker was dead, but he had still found a way to ruin dinner. That, Edward Hale would later decide, was the first honest thing anyone said about Auguste Veyron. Unfortunately, it had been said by his youngest son, 3 minutes before the poisoning. The Veyron wine estate sat on a southern hillside above a valley where everything looked older than it probably was. Rows of vines cut the slopes in dark, disciplined lines. Cypress trees stood at the road like witnesses who had already given up on human decency. The main house was pale stone, blue shutters, terracotta roof, all the usual lies rich families tell tourists when they want history to look like taste. Below the house, under the oldest part of the estate, was the cellar. That was where Auguste had left his final instruction. Not in the will, not exactly. The will itself had been read 2 hours earlier in the dining room by a lawyer who looked as if he had personally embalmed every clause. The family sat around a long table while rain worried the windows and servants moved quietly outside the door, pretending not to hear a fortune being divided like meat. The estate was not divided. That was the problem. Auguste Veyron had left almost everything unresolved. The vineyards, the brand, the export contracts, the rare bottle archive, the controlling shares of Veyron and Phil's. All of it would go to one heir, but not by age, not by blood seniority, not by sentiment, by a riddle. His eldest son, Charles Veyron, called it an insult performed after death. His daughter, Sophie, had called it on brand. His youngest son, Luke, had laughed and asked whether the old bastard had at least hidden a map. The fourth heir said nothing. That was Isabelle Moreau, Auguste's acknowledged daughter from a relationship the family had spent 30 years calling a complicated period, because affair with the cellar master's wife sounded less elegant on charity brochures. Isabelle grew up partly on the estate, partly outside it, and entirely under the eyes of people who knew exactly how much she belonged and exactly how much she did not. She knew the cellar better than the legitimate children. That made everyone nervous. The lawyer unfolded Auguste's final note. The handwriting was thin but still arrogant. My children, wine remembers what families try to forget. In the old cellar, behind the north wall, are 6 bottles from the year of the black harvest. One of them is the last true vintage. One of them is the lie that made this house rich. Choose correctly, and you inherit the vineyard. Choose poorly, and perhaps you will finally understand what I should have told you while alive. Do not ask the lawyer. Do not ask the priest. Do not ask the market. Ask the cork. When the lawyer finished reading, the family sat in silence. Not grief, calculation. Then Charles said, "He's dead and still pretentious." Sophie looked at the note. "No, he's dead and still marketing." Luke leaned back. "Honestly, I admire the commitment." Isabelle kept looking at the last line. Ask the cork. That was the only line that mattered. The cellar was opened at 10. Auguste had forbidden anyone from entering it after his illness worsened. That had been 3 months earlier. Officially, the old man wanted the rare archive preserved until the will reading. Unofficially, everyone assumed he had gone senile, paranoid, or both. Families were generous that way. Once a patriarch became inconvenient, diagnoses arrived faster than compassion. The cellar door required 2 keys, one held by the lawyer, one held by Matteo Rinaldi, the estate's head winemaker. Matteo had worked for Auguste for 26 years and looked exactly like a man who trusted barrels more than people. Heavy hands, weathered face, gray hair cut short, eyes that had spent too long judging fermentation and disappointment. He unlocked his side without speaking. The lawyer unlocked the other. The door opened with a sound like a throat clearing. Cold air moved out. Stone, dust, oak, wet earth, old wine. The family went down. Charles first, because men like Charles believe order was inheritance rehearsing. Sophie followed, phone already in hand though there was no signal below. Luke came after her carrying a glass he had filled upstairs and had been told not to bring. Isabelle descended last, behind Matteo, one hand trailing lightly along the damp wall. The cellar stretched beneath the house in long vaulted corridors. Barrels slept in rows under chalk marks. Old bottles lay behind iron grills. The light was low, amber, practical. Water ticked somewhere in the stone. The place smelled less like luxury than labor. Mold, wood, minerals, patience. "This is absurd," Charles said. Luke looked around. No, absurd was father making us sit through speeches about limestone while drunk American importers nodded like geology had feelings. Sophie smiled despite herself. Charles did not. They reached the north wall. There, behind a movable rack that Matteo had to drag aside with both hands, was a recessed niche sealed behind old iron mesh. 6 bottles lay inside. No labels, only wax seals. Black, red, green, white, gold, and blue. 6 colors, 6 possible meanings. The lawyer produced another note from a sealed envelope. Charles groaned. Of course. The lawyer read, "The last true vintage is not the oldest, not the rarest, and not the one praised by fools. It is the bottle that still carries the wound. The cork will tell you who lied. The neck will tell you who profited. The dust will tell you who touched it last." Luke raised his glass. "To Dad, may hell have a decent cellar." "Shut up," Charles snapped. "Why? Afraid he'll rewrite the will from below?" Sophie stepped closer to the mesh. "The wound," she said. "What wound?" Matteo Rinaldi's jaw tightened. Isabel noticed. Edward Hale would have noticed too, but Edward was not there yet. That was the disadvantage of murder. It often began before competent people arrived. The lawyer unlocked the mesh. The 6 bottles were placed on a stone tasting table. Black wax, red wax, green wax, white wax, gold wax, and blue wax. Charles immediately reached for the gold. Sophie laughed. "Of course you did."
"It's the only one that makes sense. It's the only one that flatters you." Lean leaned over the table. "I vote blue. Father loves pretending sadness was a flavor." Isabel touched none of them. She crouched, looking at the bottles from the side. Not the seals, the glass. Matteo watched her. That mattered too. "What are you doing?" Charles asked. "Looking," Isabel said. "At what?" "The dust." Sophie looked at the bottles. "They're all dusty." "No," Isabel said. "They're all dressed as dusty." The cellar became very quiet. Luke lowered his glass. Even Charles looked. Isabel pointed, not touching. "The black and red bottles have settled dust. The white and blue have cellar dust brushed back over them. The gold has fresh wax at the edge. Green," she paused, "green has an older cork than the bottle." Matteo closed his eyes for half a second. Charles saw it. "What does that mean?" The winemaker said nothing. The lawyer looked nervous now, which lawyers did whenever dead clients started sounding less dead than expected. Sophie whispered, "Ask the cork." Isabel stood. "The corks aren't all from the same year." Charles stared at the bottles, then at Matteo. "What the hell did my father hide down here?" Matteo finally spoke. "Not hide," he said. "Preserve." Luke gave a short laugh. "That's what families call hiding once the bottle gets expensive." No one laughed. Then Charles did what Charles had always done. He turned uncertainty into command. "We open them." The lawyer stiffened. "That was not part of the instruction. My father told us to choose. We cannot choose based on candlelight and my half-sister's dramatic relationship with dust." Isabel looked at him. "Careful, Charles. You almost sounded threatened by observation." Luke made a small choking sound into his glass. Sophie said, "Opening rare bottles could destroy value." Charles turned on her. "Your luxury relaunch destroyed value with a perfume campaign. At least I didn't run export contracts like a colonial governor with a spreadsheet." "Enough," the lawyer said weakly. It was not enough. That was the thing about inheritance. It did not create family hatred. It simply gave it minutes. Charles reached for the gold wax bottle. Matteo caught his wrist. "No." The room froze. Charles looked at the hand on him as if it were a legal offense. "Remove your hand." Matteo did, but he did not step back. "Not that one," the winemaker said. "Why?" "Because your father said to ask the cork." "Then we'll ask it by opening it." "No," Isabel said. Everyone looked at her. She was staring at the green wax bottle. "The green one has been recorked." Sophie stepped closer. "How can you tell?" "The glass line. The cork sits too high. Someone resealed it, not recently, but after the original vintage." Charles said, "Meaning?" Isabel looked at Matteo. "Meaning one of these bottles was changed years ago." The winemaker said nothing, and that silence did more damage than a confession. Luke set his upstairs glass on the stone table. "Right," he said. "This is the part where the dead man becomes annoying." The lawyer tried again. "We should stop until—" "No," Charles said. "We finish tonight." Sophie looked at him. "Why are you so desperate to finish?" "I'm desperate to stop being manipulated by a corpse." "No," Isabel said quietly. "You're desperate because you think you know which bottle gives you the vineyard."
Charles turned to her. And you think you do? I think Father wanted us to notice someone had been in the cellar. Luke looked at the 6 bottles. Well, that narrows it to everyone with keys, resentment, or a personality disorder. Then, because the Veyron family had never learned the difference between ceremony and escalation, Charles ordered the bottles opened. Not all 6. 3. Gold, green, black. Mateo refused. Charles threatened legal action. The lawyer protested. Sophie recorded nothing but watched everything. Luke muttered, "Wonderful, we've reached the stage where corks need lawyers." Isabel said, "This is a mistake." Charles said, "Then watch closely." A servant was called. A decanter was brought, then another, then glasses. Mateo opened the black wax bottle first. The cork came out clean. Too clean, Isabel thought. The green one resisted. When the cork emerged, it crumbled at one edge. Old, but not original. The gold wax bottle opened last. The cork broke halfway. Mateo cursed softly. Charles smiled. "Ask the cork," he said. "It says old." "No," Isabel said. "What does it say then?" She looked at the broken cork. That someone wanted it to look older than it is. Charles reached for the first poured glass. Enough. The wine was dark in the glass. Too dark for the light. He lifted it. Sophie said, "Charles." He ignored her. Luke said, "If you die, I'm taking your watch." Charles looked at him. "You were always cheap." Then he drank. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then Charles Veyron made a sound no one in the cellar had heard from him before. Not pain, surprise. The glass dropped from his hand and shattered on the stone. He grabbed the table, missed, and went down hard between the old bottles and the wet wall. Sophie screamed. Luke swore. The lawyer backed into the rack. Mateo moved first, but Isabel reached Charles before him. She turned him over. His lips were already darkening. His eyes were open. He tried to speak. Only one word came out. Gold. Then his body arched once and stopped. Above them, in the old house, the rain finally began. By midnight, the official story was already forming. Auguste Baron had left a cruel inheritance game. Charles had chosen the gold bottle. The wine was poisoned. The heir died trying to claim the estate. By 1 in the morning, Inspector Ashcroft called Edward Hale. "You are going to hate this," she said. "You should start varying your openings. Dead vineyard owner, inheritance riddle, 6 unlabeled bottles in a cellar, 1 heir drinks from a poisoned vintage." Edward sat up and reached for his coat. "That is not hate. That is irritation with atmosphere. There's more, of course." The dead heir said one word before dying. "Gold?" Silence. Then Ashcroft said, "How did you know?" "Because inheritance poisons rarely kill people before they name what they wanted. The family claims the gold bottle was the correct one. Then it probably wasn't. There's an illegitimate daughter who says the dust was staged." Edward stood and reached for his coat. "Keep her away from the bottles." "You think she did it?" "No," Edward said. "I think she looked at them before choosing a story. That makes her useful." He ended the call. Outside, rain struck the window harder. Somewhere beneath an old vineyard, a dead man's riddle had turned into a murder. Edward already knew the first rule. The poison would not be in the wine. Not really. Families always blamed the bottle, but bottles were only containers. The truth usually entered through the hands. Chapter 1. The Cellar. Edward Hale arrived at the Veyron estates at 1:58 p.m., which was a terrible hour for wine and an excellent hour for lies. The rain had settled over the vineyard in thin silver lines. Under the house lights, the vines looked like rows of black ribs running down the hillside. Police cars stood on the gravel drive beside 2 old cypress trees, their blue lights flashing across wet stone, bronze drain pipes, and the kind of expensive rustic architecture that existed mostly to convince rich people their money had once been soil. Inspector Ashcroft met him under the archway. She wore a dark coat, wet hair, and the expression of someone who had already heard too many relatives say, "Father would have wanted this handled privately." She said, "Welcome to wine country. I smell inheritance. That may be the cellar." "No," Edward said. "Cellars are usually more honest." They crossed the courtyard toward the side entrance. A constable held the door open. Inside, the estate house was all old beams, polished floors, family portraits, and floral arrangements that looked expensive enough to have legal representation. "The dead man?" Edward asked. "Charles Veyron, eldest son, 47. Acting head of export operations, drank during the cellar selection and collapsed almost immediately. Paramedics declared him dead before transport." "Poison confirmed?" Not yet. Symptoms suggest acute toxin, cyanosis, collapse, convulsion, rapid cardiac failure. Lab has samples. And everyone says the gold bottle was poisoned? Everyone says many things. The loudest version is gold. That means we begin with everything except gold. Ashcroft gave him a sideways look. I knew you'd be irritating about that. I tried to stay consistent. They reached the cellar door. 2 officers stood outside. One of them had the pale face of a young man who had discovered rich families did not make death cleaner. The door itself was thick oak banded with black iron. Old, functional, not decorative. Good. Edward disliked decorative security. It lied even before people did. Ashcroft handed him gloves. Scene is mostly preserved. Body removed. 3 open bottles left in place after photography. Glass fragments marked. Decanters bagged but still in cellar. 6 original bottles documented. 3 unopened secured in rack area. Head winemaker is furious. About the death? About the corks. Professional grief. I respect it. They went down. The cellar was colder than the house by at least 10 degrees. The stone steps were worn at the center from generations of feet. Servants first, heirs later, police now. The air thickened as they descended. Wet limestone, oak, mold, dust, old alcohol, the faint coppery sharpness of panic. At the bottom, the cellar opened into a vaulted chamber. Edward stopped, not at the body marker, at the room. Rows of barrels lined one wall. Locked cages of bottles ran along the other. The north wall had been opened behind a movable rack, revealing a recessed niche with old iron mesh, now unlocked. In the center of the chamber stood a stone tasting table. On it, 6 marked spaces, 3 empty where bottles had been opened, 3 bottles still standing in evidence frames. Black wax, red wax, white wax, blue wax. No, Edward corrected himself. The opened ones were black, green, and gold. The green and gold had been moved to forensic supports. The black remained standing near a decanter, recorked loosely for preservation. Shards from Charles's glass glittered inside a tape square on the floor. Edward walked to the table without touching anything. Who opened them? Matteo Rinaldi, head winemaker. Against his judgment? Yes. On Charles's order? Yes. Good. Ashcroft sighed. You're going to keep saying that until I arrest you. Edward ignored her and crouched near the stone floor. The glass had shattered outward from waist height. Liquid darkened the stone in an irregular splash, now swabbed but still visible. The smell there was not merely wine. Bitter, metallic, but bitterness after poisoning was unreliable. Once a room learned death had entered through taste, every nose became a novelist. He stood and looked at the table again. Which glass did Charles drink from? Ashcroft pointed. His own tasting glass, poured from the gold bottle. By whom? Matteo poured. Charles lifted it himself. Did anyone else drink? No. Convenient for survival, inconvenient for certainty. He moved closer to the corks. They had been bagged separately and labeled. Black cork intact, green cork crumbled edge, gold cork broken halfway. Edward pointed. Give me gold. Ashcroft handed him the evidence bag. He held it under the cellar lamp. Old cork, or pretending to be old. The surface was stained and crumbly, but the fracture was wrong. Too dry at the outer edges, too clean within. Artificial distressing? Possible. A recorked bottle dressed for inheritance theater. He looked at the green cork next. Different problem. Older material but set too high in the neck according to Isabel. Reused cork? Reinserted? The wound Auguste mentioned. Ask the cork. The old bastard had not been poetic. He had been technical. Edward liked him slightly more dead than expected. What did Charles say before dying? He asked. Gold. Only that? Yes. People love making their last words useless. Or useful. No. Useful last words are usually reported by people who need them useful. Ashcroft nodded toward the stairs. Family heard it. Exactly. He turned to the niche. Show me the original positions. Ashcroft opened a photograph on her tablet. 6 bottles lay horizontally in the niche, arranged left to right, black, red, green, white, gold, blue. No labels, colored wax only. Edward studied the image. Dust patterns, neck angles, wax condition. The gold bottle sat slightly deeper than the others, green slightly forward, black with heavier dust along the shoulder, blue and white brushed, red untouched? Hard to tell. Isabel said the dust was staged. Yes, she was right. Ashcroft looked at him. You haven't been here 5 minutes. Dust has no loyalty. He enlarged the photo. The bottles were not all stored here for the same length of time. Black and red show settled accumulation along the lower shoulder consistent with long rest. White and blue have disturbed dust brushed back over them from above. Gold has waxed too clean at the neck edge despite surface dirt. Green has a cork line inconsistent with its glass age. Ashcroft stared. You got all that from a photo? No, from the photo and the fact that everyone else is arguing about color. Color is the bait. He stepped toward the niche. The riddle said the cork tells who lied, the neck tells who profited, the dust tells who touched it last. Meaning? Meaning Auguste expected someone to examine bottle history, not taste inheritance like drunk aristocrats at a harvest festival. A voice behind them said, I told them not to open the gold. Edward turned. Matteo Rinaldi stood at the bottom of the stairs, flanked by an officer who looked grateful to have delivered him. The winemaker wore a dark work jacket, mud on his boots, and a face carved by weather, tannin, and contempt. His hands were broad and stained faintly around the nails. Not dirty exactly, more lived in by labor. You're Matteo, Edward said. I am. You opened the bottle, because Charles ordered it. You could have refused. I did. Then you obeyed. Matteo's jaw tightened. Yes. Edward nodded. That will annoy you longer than guilt. Good. Matteo looked at Ashcroft. Who is this? Unfortunately necessary, she said. Edward pointed to the bottles. Which one is the last true vintage? Matteo said nothing. Edward waited. Silence in cellars had texture. It gathered in barrels and corners. This one carried old fear. Finally, Matteo said, I don't know. No, you know what Auguste wanted them to notice. That is not the same thing. Matteo looked at him carefully now. Good. What was the Black Harvest? Edward asked. Matteo's face closed. Ashcroft checked her notes. Year of major frost and rot. Estate nearly collapsed. Then supposedly produced a tiny legendary vintage now worth absurd sums. Supposedly, Edward said. Matteo said it was not legendary. There it is. The winemaker looked away. Edward continued. The famous Black Harvest wine was a lie. Matteo did not answer. He didn't need to. Ashcroft stepped closer. Explain. Matteo's voice was rough. That year, most of the grapes were ruined. Auguste made a small batch from surviving parcels. Good wine, not great, not worth the legend. Later, bottles appeared, rare Black Harvest reserves. Collectors paid, critics praised, importers fought. The estate survived. Fake vintage, Edward said. Blended and relabeled, some from later years, some purchased, some, he stopped. Some what? Some corrected. Edward almost smiled. Excellent euphemism. It was not mine. Whose? Auguste's, of course. And one of the children knew. Matteo looked at the bottles. One of them profited. The neck will tell you who profited. Edward turned back to the 6 bottles. What does the neck tell? Matteo hesitated. Edward said, if you make me drag every answer out of you, I will become bored and then unpleasant. Ashcroft murmured, as opposed to now. Matteo pointed to the gold bottle. Gold wax was used for export archive samples. Charles controlled export. And green? Cellar Reserve, my mark, or my department's. Black? Original Black Harvest seal. Red? Family private stock. White? Marketing sample. Blue? Charity auction line. So each color corresponded to a department, history, or family route. Gold was Charles. Of course he chose it. But the riddle said the last true vintage was not the rarest, not the praised one, not the one fools chose. Charles chose his own profit, then died. Too neat. Edward disliked neat deaths. They were usually arranged for observers. Was the poison in the gold wine? He asked. Matteo looked offended. I don't know. That was not a philosophical question. The lab will say. And your nose? Matteo's expression darkened. The gold wine was wrong, but not poison wrong. Meaning, too young under the oxidation. Someone made it old on the outside. Edward nodded. Bottle dressed, cork aged, wax fresh at edge, dust staged. Yes. So Charles drank from a false gold vintage. Yes. And died. Yes. Edward turned to Ashcroft. The poison was probably not in the wine. Matteo looked sharply at him. Ashcroft said, you keep saying that. Because the killer wants everyone to ask which bottle was poisoned. Better question, which object touched only Charles when he chose gold? He looked at the table. Bottle, cork, glass, decanter, corkscrew, wax knife. What tool opened the gold bottle? Mateo pointed to a bagged corkscrew and small blade. Same opener for all three. Was it cleaned between bottles? Mateo stiffened. No. Order: black, green, gold. Edward's eyes moved to the bagged tool. If poison were on the corkscrew, black or green drinkers would risk exposure before gold, unless activated by wax, or placed in gold cork, or transferred to Charles's glass. Ashcroft said, "The servant brought glasses." Same set? Yes. Who handled Charles's glass? Servant placed, Mateo poured, Charles picked up. Anyone else? Luke touched one glass, but claims it was his own from upstairs. Edward glanced toward the stairs. Of course he did. He looked back at the broken glass marker. Charles said gold because he realized the gold bottle was wrong. Mateo's face shifted. Maybe. No. He was arrogant, not poetic. Last word would be the thing his mind had just been defending. Gold. His claim, his bottle, his mistake. Edward walked around the table to the spot where Charles had stood. From there, the gold bottle would be directly before him. The decanter slightly left, the cork on the table, the broken cork half near his hand. He checked photo. Yes, Charles had picked up the broken cork before drinking. Why? To inspect it. Asked the cork. He had mucked the riddle but still checked it. Did Charles handle the gold cork? Edward asked. Mateo looked at Ashcroft. I think so. Ashcroft reviewed notes. Sophie says he picked it up and said it proved age. Isabel says he rubbed the broken end. Luke says he was being unbearable with it. Lawyer, unsure. Edward nodded. There. What? Ashcroft asked. The object that touched only Charles. The cork. Yes. Poison on cork? Possibly. Or on the broken interface. He handled it, then drank. Transfer from fingers to glass or mouth. Mateo looked ill. Poisoning a cork is sacrilege. Killing people is usually worse. Not in this cellar, Ashcroft muttered. Edward leaned over the gold cork evidence bag again. The broken interior looked clean to the eye, but he saw a faint shine along one fracture line. Maybe moisture, maybe oil, maybe nothing. Lab this first, he said. Ashcroft signaled the officer. Edward turned to Mateo. Who knew Charles would choose gold? Mateo looked at him. Everyone. No, everyone thought Charles would choose gold. Who knew enough to weaponize that? Mateo did not answer. Charles controlled export. Gold wax belonged to export archive samples. He would reach for it because he believed the estate already belonged to him. That is character, not knowledge. A killer who relies on character either knows the victim well or hates him accurately. Mateo's eyes moved to the stairs. His siblings hated him accurately. Good. Now we talk to them. Ashcroft asked, which one first? Edward looked at the 6-bottle photograph again. Isabel noticed dust. Sophie noticed market value. Luke noticed absurdity. Charles noticed gold. The family had each seen a different cellar. That meant Auguste had built the riddle for more than inheritance. He had built it to expose memory. Isabel, Edward said. The illegitimate daughter? The observant daughter. That matters? It usually matters more. He looked once more at the old niche. Keep the family away from the bottles, especially Sophie. Why Sophie? Edward pointed to the white wax bottle in the photo. Because the marketing sample was moved recently and brushed back with fake dust, and Sophie controls marketing. Yes. Finally, a useful color. Edward looked at her. No, a useful lie. Chapter 2. Isabel Moreau. Isabel Moreau waited in the tasting room with a cup of coffee she had not touched. That was already more useful than 3 witness statements. People drank aftershock if they wanted warmth. They held cups aftershock if they wanted something between their hands and the room. Isabel had chosen neither. The cup sat on the table, cooling into black bitterness while she stood by the window, looking out at the rain over the vines. The tasting room had been designed for wealthy visitors who wanted authenticity with polished floors, stone walls, oak beams, shelves of bottles backlit like saints, a long counter for guided tastings, framed awards on the wall, photographs of Auguste Fyron shaking hands with critics, importers, chefs, ministers, and other professional parasites of taste. Edward Hale entered with Ashcroft. Isabel did not turn immediately. Is Charles dead? She asked. Yes, Ashcroft said. Isabel nodded once. Not grief, not relief. Acknowledgement. That mattered. She was in her late 30s, dark-haired, sharp-faced, wearing a plain black sweater and boots still damp from the cellar. No jewelry except small silver earrings. She had the stillness of someone who had been forced to learn, very young, that rooms could decide whether she belonged before she said a word. Edward took the chair opposite the untouched coffee. "You noticed the dust," he said. Now she turned. Her eyes were tired, but clear. "You're not starting with, 'Did you kill your brother?' No. If you had, the dust would have been worse." Ashcroft muttered, "That almost sounded like evidence." "It is evidence, just not admissible unless people become tedious." Isabel looked at him for 1 second, then sat. "I didn't kill Charles." "I know." Ashcroft looked at Edward. He ignored her. Isabel did not look grateful. "Good. Gratitude made witnesses stupid. Tell me about the bottles." "The 6 from the niche?" "Yes." "They were staged." "All 6? "No. That's the point. Some were staged, some were old in the wrong way." Edward nodded. "Go on." She leaned forward. Black and red had settled cellar dust, real dust. It grows in layers. It gathers low first, then softens along the shoulder. If you move a bottle after years, the dust breaks at the contact points. You can't put it back correctly unless you're very patient or very dead. August was patient. Yes, not dead when he arranged it. And the others? White and blue were brushed. Someone tried to restore dust after movement, too evenly. People who don't work in cellars think dust is dirt. It isn't. It has direction. Edward glanced at Ashcroft. "She's right." Ashcroft said, "I'll add 'dust has direction' to the list of things I hate learning at 2 in the morning." Isabel almost smiled. Edward continued. "Gold," she said, "theatrical." Meaning, fresh wax edge, old surface dirt, wrong smell near the neck. Wrong smell? Warm wax, not cellar wax. Recent. Someone resealed it and tried to age it with surface grime. And green. She hesitated. Good. Green mattered. "The green bottle was the strange one," she said. "Older cork than bottle. Neck scarred where an old cork had been forced into newer glass. Wax cracked naturally, but not originally. It had been recorked long ago, not recently." "Why?" "To preserve a lie," she said. Edward watched her. "Your father's." She did not say our father. Also useful. Ashcroft stepped closer. "Tell us about the Black Harvest." Isabel looked toward the shelves of awards. "The official story? Frost destroyed almost everything. August saved one tiny parcel, made a miraculous vintage. Critics called it savage, mineral, impossible. Collectors paid insane money. The estate survived." "And the true story? The grapes were ruined. The real Black Harvest was thin, angry, barely drinkable, maybe historically interesting. Not great, not valuable. Then how did the legend happen?" Isabel looked down at the coffee. "My mother knew." Edward waited. There it was. The emotional cork. "Your mother was a cellar master's wife," he said. His assistant first, then his wife, then August's mistake according to the polite version. And according to the impolite version, she helped build the Black Harvest lie. Silence. Rain ticked against the window. Isabel continued. She had a better palate than August and better memory than Mateo. She knew which later parcels could be blended to imitate the ruined year. She helped recork bottles, re-wax, record false cellar positions. She thought it would save the estate for one season, but it became a legend. Yes, lies that make money become tradition. Edward nodded. A very good line. She had earned it. And August kept 6 bottles to expose it, or to control it, Isabel said. My father never exposed anything until it became useful. That sounded accurate. What did he mean by the wound? Edward asked. Isabel's face changed. Small. Pain or recognition. The frost split the Old North parcel, not metaphorically. A stone retaining wall cracked and one row of vines was cut down almost to black wood. My mother marked the few bottles made from that true damaged row with a cut in the cork. A wound. Yes. Which bottle carries it? Green. Ashcroft frowned. But green was cellar reserve. It used to be, before the lie became more profitable than the wine. Edward leaned back. So the last true vintage was green? I think so. Charles chose gold because gold was export. Yes. And gold was his department. Yes. Who else knew green mattered? Isabel looked toward the door. Mateo. Maybe Sophie. Maybe my father's old records. Maybe anyone who cared more about corks than metals. Luke? Luke cares more than he pretends. That's how he survives being dismissed. Charles? No. Charles thought truth had a market value only after he owned it. And Sophie? Isabel's mouth tightened. Sophie would understand what a fake vintage could do to the brand, meaning she had motive to stop the riddle. She had motive to bury it under a tasteful campaign. Different crime. Sometimes. Edward liked that answer. Who hated Charles most? Ashcroft asked. Isabel looked at her. In this house? That's not a question. That's seating order. Edward almost smiled. Try anyway. Sophie hated that he treated the estate like a conquered export route. Luke hated that Charles treated him like a family joke. Mateo hated him for not understanding wine. The lawyer feared him. I hated him because he deserved it. Honest. Not useful? Honest is often useful later. Ashcroft said, Did you handle the gold cork? No. Gold bottle? No. Any bottle? No. You were close enough. Yes. Why not touch? Isabel looked at Edward. Because father said ask the cork. The first person touching without knowing what to ask was already answering wrong. Good. Very good. Edward stood and walked to the shelf of awards. Your father expected someone to choose badly. Yes. Charles. Probably. But did he expect Charles to die? Isabel's face hardened. No. You're sure? My father was cruel, not wasteful. Charles alive and humiliated would have been more useful to him than Charles dead. Edward turned. That is a kind of family insight police reports rarely survive. Ashcroft said, We try. No, you don't. She gave him a look. He moved on. Who opened the bottles? Mateo. Who insisted? Charles. Who selected gold? Charles. Who selected green? No one. I was about to. Before Charles ordered opening? Yes. That mattered. If Isabel would have chosen green and green was the true bottle, then poisoning gold could be aimed at Charles specifically, unless the killer expected Charles to choose gold. Character-based murder. Still too easy. Did Charles handle anything else before drinking? Edward asked. The cork, Isabel said. The broken gold cork. He rubbed it at the fracture and said it proved age. What hand? Right. Then drank? Yes. Same hand? Yes. And no one else touched that cork. Mateo pulled it, it broke, he set both pieces down. Charles grabbed one. Which piece? The inner half. Inner half. The part that had been inside the neck. Edward was already moving. Ashcroft followed. Where are you going? To make the cork explain itself before another air becomes poetic. Isabel stood. Can I come? No, Ashcroft said. Edward looked back. Yes. Ashcroft stared at him. She sees dust. This is a police investigation, and currently our best witness is a woman who can tell old mold from theatrical dirt. Isabel said, That may be the nicest thing anyone in this house has ever said to me. It wasn't nice, it was classification. She followed. They returned to the cellar. Mateo was still there, arguing quietly with an officer about temperature changes to sealed evidence. He stopped when he saw Isabel. You told them, Isabel said. Enough. Not enough. Edward stepped between them. Domestic cellar tragedy later. Cork now. Ashcroft handed him the gold cork evidence bag. Isabel leaned close but did not touch. Edward turned the bag under the lamp. Inner half, he said. Isabel pointed. There, that shine. I saw it earlier. That shouldn't be there. Mateo came closer. His face changed. What? Ashcroft asked. Mateo said, Oil. From the wine, he said? No. Edward looked at him. From the poison carrier. Mateo swallowed. If someone placed it in the inner cork fracture, it would not contaminate the whole bottle, only the piece handled after opening. And Charles rubbed it. Ashcroft finished the thought, then drank from the same hand. Edward nodded. Poison on cork, not in wine. Mateo cursed in Italian. Isabel looked at the gold bottle. So the bottle was bait. Yes, Edward said, not the weapon. The cork was the weapon. Ashcroft asked, Who could poison the inner cork after it broke? No one, Edward said. It was prepared to break. Mateo's eyes narrowed. Yes. Explain. The winemaker took the evidence bag carefully by the edge and pointed without touching the cork itself. Cork was cut and weakened before insertion, treated outside to look old, fracture lying plant. When pulled, it breaks, inner half exposed, poison on fracture. Mateo rubs it because he wants proof of age, and anyone who knows Charles knows he would do that, Edward said. Isabel nodded slowly. He always needed the object to agree with him. Edward looked at Ashcroft. Now we have method. Good. Suspect? He looked at the remaining bottles. Gold for Charles, white for Sophie, green for truth, blue for charity, black for myth, red for family. Someone knew Charles would choose gold. Someone prepared a false gold bottle with a poison cork. Someone understood both wine handling and Charles's arrogance. Ashcroft looked at Matteo. Matteo said, "No." Edward looked at him. "I didn't accuse you yet."
You were about to.
"No, I was about to ask why the head winemaker allowed a false gold bottle in a Gust-sealed niche." Matteo said nothing. Isabel looked at him. "Matteo?" The old winemaker's face collapsed by half an inch. Not guilt, old obedience. "Because Auguste told me to." Edward nodded. "At last." Matteo's voice went rough. "He built the riddle, I placed the bottles, but I did not poison the cork." "Who knew the arrangement?" "Only Auguste and me." "And after Auguste died?" Matteo looked at the cellar stairs. "The lawyer had the inventory." Edward turned to Ashcroft. "The lawyer's name?" "Etienne Alcourt." "Bring him." Ashcroft nodded. Edward looked at Isabel. "And Sophie." Isabel's eyebrows lifted. "Why Sophie?" "Because white was moved recently. Marketing sample. Your sister understands the value of fake authenticity. And if she knew the riddle would expose the Black Harvest fraud, she had the most to lose publicly." Isabel thought about that, then said, "Sophie doesn't kill with poison." "No?" "No. Sophie kills with a press release." Edward nodded. "Then perhaps she hired someone with better cellar skills." Matteo looked up sharply. There it was, a reaction. Edward saw it. So did Isabel. Ashcroft smiled thinly. "Now," she said, "we're finally getting somewhere." Chapter 3. Sophie Veyron. Sophie Veyron received Edward Hale in the branding room. Not the office, not the salon, not the family library, the branding room. That already told him more than her first answer would. It sat above the old tasting room overlooking the wet vineyard through a long window. One wall held label mock-ups, export maps, award plaques, campaign boards, photographs of smiling tourists, and a projected slogan that read, "Veyron, the truth of the soil." Edward looked at the slogan for 3 seconds, then said, "Optimistic." Sophie turned from the window. She was 42, elegant, sharp, and dressed in black with the precision of someone who understood mourning as a visual language. Her hair was pulled back. Her face was dry. Her eyes were red, but not soft. Good. People like Sophie did not become helpless under pressure. They became edited. Inspector Ashcroft stood near the door. Isabel had not been allowed into this interview. She had protested. Edward had ignored her. Useful witnesses became less useful when they started enjoying accuracy too much. Sophie looked at Edward. "You're the detective." "Yes, and you've already decided I'm a monster because my wall says truth above a forged vintage." A small pause. Sophie smiled, not warmly. "Fair." She sat at the long table. Edward remained standing. "Tell me about the white bottle," he said. That surprised her. "Not much. Enough." "The white bottle?" "Yes. My brother died after drinking from the gold bottle." "Your brother died after touching the gold cork." Her eyes moved once toward Ashcroft. Ashcroft said nothing. Sophie turned back. "You found something." "We've found enough to make color less interesting." "Then why ask about white?" "Because it was moved recently." Sophie's face settled. There it was, control returning. "The white wax bottle was part of a campaign archive. For your department." "Yes." "Marketing sample?" "Yes." "Was it fake?" She laughed once. "Mr. Hale, this entire industry is fake after the second adjective." "Good, then answer." Her smile thinned. "The white bottle was not fake, it was curated." Ashcroft looked up. Edward said, "Curated is what fraud says when it can afford typography." Sophie leaned back. "You're enjoyable in a professionally unpleasant way. I get that often from people near evidence." She sighed. "The white bottle was assembled for an anniversary campaign 10 years ago. Same vineyard, different year. We never sold it as Black Harvest." "No?" "No. We photographed it beside Black Harvest bottles because the light was better on white wax." Ashcroft said, "That sounds like selling a lie without printing it." Sophie turned to her. "Inspector, most luxury goods are sold between what is said and what is understood." Edward nodded. "Finally, honesty." Sophie looked at him again. "What do you want?" "The riddle exposed the Black Harvest fraud." "Yes. You knew it?" "Not before tonight." "Wrong." Her eyes hardened. "You say that as if contradiction is proof." "No. Your wall proves it. Your campaigns needed the Black Harvest legend. If Auguste destroyed that legend, your department collapses first." My father built the legend before I was born, and you made it scalable. That hit. Slightly. Good. Sophie stood and walked to the campaign wall. She touched one photograph. August in the old cellar, holding a dusty bottle under golden light. Do you know what my father hated most? She asked. Probably sincerity. He hated waste. Bad harvest? Sell scarcity. Family scandal? Sell passion. Illegitimate daughter? Sell rustic complexity if she becomes useful. She looked back. He made lies. I gave them distribution. Did that bother you? Less than poverty would have. A sharp answer. Useful. Edward moved closer to the wall. When did you learn the black harvest was blended and relabeled? Sophie did not answer. When, he repeated. 6 years ago. How? An old export invoice. Charles had misfiled it. Charles? Yes. What did he do when you found it? He told me to delete it.
Did you?
No. Why? Insurance. Edward almost smiled. There she is. Sophie's voice cooled. Charles controlled exports. He treated me like a decorator with spreadsheets. I kept proof because men like Charles understand documents only when they point at his throat. Did he know you kept proof? Yes. Did August know? A pause. Yes. Then the riddle was aimed at both of you. She looked away. For the first time, the polished surface cracked. Not grief, resentment. My father enjoyed making children compete for crumbs, then calling it character. And tonight? Tonight was his final tasting menu of cruelty. Did you poison the gold cork? No. Could you? No. Wrong again. She turned sharply. I know branding, Mr. Hale, not cellar mechanics. You knew enough to move the white bottle and brush dust over it. Silence. Ashcroft's pen moved. Sophie's face became still. That, she said, was not murder. No, it was panic with accessories. Sophie looked at the rain outside. I moved it 2 nights ago. Why? To see whether father's note matched the bottles. How did you get into the cellar? Mateo's key was in the office. Convenient. He was with father's lawyer. I borrowed it. Stole it. Borrowed without expectation of permission. Marketing again. She almost laughed despite herself. Edward said, you moved the white bottle. Yes. Did you touch gold? No. Green. She hesitated. Yes. Good. What did you see? That the green bottle was wrong. Wrong how? The cork, the neck. I didn't understand it like Isabel, but I saw it had been resealed. Old reseal, not recent. Did you understand green was the true vintage? No. I thought green was evidence of the fraud. And white? My department, I panicked and checked whether father had planted something on me. Had he? No. That was almost insulting. Edward nodded. This sounded true. Sophie was guilty of brand preservation, not cork poisoning. Still dangerous, not central. Who knew you entered the cellar? No one. Wrong. She closed her eyes briefly. Luke saw me come back. Luke. Yes. When? Near midnight. He was in the courtyard smoking and pretending not to be drunk. Did he ask? He said, if you're robbing the corpse, at least wear better shoes. Ashcroft actually smiled. Edward did not. What did you tell him? That father had left us a loaded gun and I was checking the safety. Did Luke know about the black harvest fraud? Sophie opened her eyes. Luke knows fragments. He listens when people think he's useless. That is his only adult skill. Could he poison a cork? No. Are you sure? He barely opens bottles without making it theatrical. Could he know Charles would choose gold? Everyone knew Charles would choose gold. That keeps being the family answer. It is lazy and therefore probably true. Sophie looked at him. Do you think Luke did it? I think Luke is next. Her expression shifted again. This time, fear. Not for Luke. For herself. Why? Because Charles died from a cork prepared for Charles. That requires someone who knew Charles's arrogance, but it also requires access to the stage cellar after Auguste arranged the riddle. You entered 2 nights ago. Luke saw you. If he saw you, he may have entered after you. Sophie said nothing. Edward looked at the campaign slogan again. The truth of the soil. Did Charles threaten Luke recently? Sophie folded her arms. Charles threatened everyone constantly. It was his substitute for personality. Specifically, he wanted to cut Luke out of the family allowance after the will settled. Why? Luke had debts. To whom? Collectors, restaurants, probably women with better judgment than patience, and one auction house. What auction house? She looked at him. Wine. There it was. Rare bottles. Yes. Black Harvest. I don't know. Yes, you do. She hesitated. He sold one last year, quietly. Charles found out. Was it real? Sophie gave a bitter little smile. In this house, that word needs a chair and a lawyer. Edward turned to Ashcroft. Get Luke. Ashcroft nodded and stepped out. Sophie stayed by the window. You think this is about money? No, Edward said. Money is only the language this family uses because emotion would lower the tone. She laughed once, then stopped. Charles was awful, she said. Yes, but he was still my brother. Yes, that should mean something. It does. What? Edward looked at the door. It means the person who killed him knew exactly how awful he was and still had to live close enough to call it family. Sophie looked away. For once, she had no slogan. Luc Veron was not in his assigned room. That was unsurprising. He was not in the salon, the dining room, the courtyard, the covered terrace, or the guest wing. That was more interesting. They found him back in the cellar, not near the body marker, near the blue waxed bottle. He was standing with his hands in his pockets, staring at it as if it insulted him first. Ashcroft stopped at the foot of the stairs. Mr. Veron. Luke turned. He was 35, unshaven, elegant in the ruined way of men who learned early that charm could delay accountability but not remove it. He wore a velvet jacket over a wrinkled shirt and looked too sober now for the amount he had drunk earlier. That sounds official. It is. Shame. I prefer my disasters informal. Edward walked past him to the blue bottle. Charity auction line, he said. Luke looked at him. You've been color-coding our sins? Someone had to. Luke smiled faintly. Then you'll need more colors. Edward pointed to the blue bottle. You sold one. The smile vanished. Silence. Good. Black Harvest? Edward asked. Luke looked at Sophie, who had followed them down despite being told not to. Of course she had. Dear sister, Luke said, you wound me. Sophie replied, not fatally apparently. Ashcroft said, enough. Edward stayed with Luke. You sold a bottle last year that covered debts. Luke looked at the old stone floor. Yes. Was it real? Luke laughed softly. Nothing in this family is real until it's invoiced. Answer. I thought it was Black Harvest. Was it? No. How do you know? Because the buyer had it tested. And I was told I had sold a dress bottle from a later year with forged Cellar marks. Who told you? Luke's face changed. Charles. Not the buyer? Charles complained through Charles. Charles paid to bury it and added the amount to my personal debt. Edward nodded. Charles knew you had stolen from the cellar. Yes, and Sophie knew. Everyone knew enough to enjoy not saying it. What did Auguste do? Look toward the niche. Nothing. That was worse. No speech, no punishment. He just looked at me one day and said, even thieves should learn to read corks. Edward glanced at Ashcroft. There. Auguste had been building the riddle around Luke too. Did you enter the cellar after Sophie? Edward asked. Luke looked at his sister. Sophie said nothing. He sighed. Yes. When? After midnight 2 nights ago. Why? To see what she had touched? Did you touch gold cork? No. Green? Yes. Blue? He glanced at the bottle. Yes. Why blue? Because I thought father knew about the auction. He did. Yes, well, the dead are famously overinformed. Did you poison the gold cork? Luke stared at him. No. Could you? I'm a drunk, not an alchemist. False distinction. Luke almost smiled, then didn't. Edward stepped closer. Charles is going to cut you off. Yes. Charles knew about the sold bottle. Yes. Charles would choose gold. Everyone knew Charles would choose gold. Edward looked bored. Family motto? Luke exhaled. You think I killed him because I'm broke? Not yet. What does that mean? It means you have motive and access, but your vanity points elsewhere. Luke frowned. My vanity? You came back to blue. Silence. Guilty people return to the object they fear. Grieving people return to the body. Thieves return to the theft. Luke looked at the blue bottle. His face changed. What's in it? Edward asked. Luke said nothing. What did you see 2 nights ago? Luke swallowed. The blue bottle was wrong too. How? It was the one I sold. The cellar went silent. Sophie whispered, What? Luke looked at her. I recognize the scratch on the punt. I made it years ago hiding it under my jacket like an idiot. Father had it back, or replaced. I don't know. Edward nodded slowly. Auguste had recovered the stolen bottle and put it into the riddle. The riddle was not one secret, it was 6 accusations. Black, myth. Gold, Charles export fraud. White, Sylphie marketing lie. Blue, Luke theft. Green, true vintage. Red, family? Something's still missing. Edward looked at the unopened red bottle. Who does red belong to, he asked. No one answered. Not Sophie, not Luke, not Matteo, standing in the shadows near the barrel row. Isabel, who had appeared at the bottom of the stairs without permission, answered quietly. Blood. Edward turned. What? The red bottle, Isabel said. Family private stock. Yes. She looked at the bottle. Then it's mine. The cellar went still again. Luke said, oh hell. Sophie said nothing. Edward looked at Isabel. Why? Isabel said, because father once told me red wax was for bottles that should have stayed inside the house. Illegitimacy. Not just that. Matteo's face had gone pale. Edward saw it. Now the final shift shifted. This was not just fraud, theft, branding, export. Red was blood. Green was truth. Gold was Charles. White Sophie. Blue Luke. Red Isabel. And Matteo knew. Edward turned to the winemaker. What is in the red bottle? Matteo said nothing. Edward stepped closer. What did Auguste put in the red bottle? Matteo's voice was almost inaudible. Her mother's last blend. Isabel froze. Sophie closed her eyes. Luke whispered, Jesus. Edward did not move. When did her mother die? He asked. Matteo looked at Isabel, not Edward. The year after the Black Harvest. How? No answer. Edward's voice sharpened. How? Matteo swallowed. Cellar accident. Isabel's face emptied. No, Edward said quietly. Not accident. Matteo looked away. And now Edward understood why the cellar had not finished killing. Charles was dead, but the riddle had more bottles, more lies, and one of them had just begun bleeding through the wax. Chapter 4. The Red Bottle. The red bottle sat in the cellar like a body no one had yet agreed to name. That was the problem with old family secrets. They rarely stayed hidden because they were clever. They stayed hidden because everyone near them learned to look slightly to the left. Edward Hale stood before the 6-bottle niche and looked at the red wax. The seal was darker than the others, not bright red, old blood red, the kind of color luxury brands loved because it made rot look expensive. Isabel Moreau stood beside him, very still. Matteo Rinaldi had not moved since saying the words, her mother's last blend. Sophie Veyron looked irritated, but not in her usual polished way. Luke looked sober enough to hate it. Inspector Ashcroft stood by the stone table, watching all of them with the expression of a woman who had just realized the murder investigation had found a basement under the basement. Edward pointed to the red bottle. Who placed it in the niche? Matteo swallowed. I did. On Auguste's instruction? Yes. When? 3 months ago. After he became ill? Yes. And the bottle itself? Matteo looked at Isabel. It was kept separately. Where? In the old private rack, behind the west barrels. Why? No answer. Edward turned fully toward him. Matteo. The winemaker looked at the floor. Because Auguste did not want it cataloged. Isabel's voice was low. My mother made it. Yes. When? The year after the Black Harvest. The year she died. Matteo closed his eyes briefly. Yes. Sophie crossed her arms. This is obscene. Luke looked at her. That's never stopped the family before. Not now, Luke. One else. During the next poisoning? Ashcroft said, enough. Edward did not look away from Matteo. How did Isabel's mother die? Matteo's jaw worked once. Her name was Claire. Isabel did not move, but the name changed something in her face. She had probably heard it all her life from the wrong mouth. Claire Moreau. The cellar master's wife. The affair. The mistake. The complication. Now it had entered the room without decoration. Claire died in the press room, Matteo said, crushed by a barrel cradle during night transfer. Accident? That was the report. That was not my question. Matteo looked up. No, he said. The cellar went quiet. Even Luke stopped performing. Edward said, who killed her? Matteo's face tightened with old pain. I don't know. Wrong. Matteo's eyes flashed. I was not there. No, Edward said, but you know which lie was poured over the body. That hit. Matteo looked at Auguste's old bottles as if one of them might still order him silent. Finally, he said, Claire had discovered the full Black Harvest fraud, not only the blending, The sales, the forged allocations, the collector records. She wanted Auguste to stop before more fake bottles entered the market. Sophie looked away. Luke whispered, "Of course she did." Edward asked, "And Auguste?" He said the estate would die. She said, "Then let it die clean." Isabel's mouth tightened. That sounded like a mother worth having. "What happened that night?" Ashcroft asked. Matteo rubbed his hands together once, a cellarman's gesture, trying to warm memory that had gone cold decades ago. There was a storm, harvest machinery moving late. Auguste had been arguing with Claire. The next morning, she was found under the cradle. Who found her? I did. Who reported it? Auguste. Who signed the accident report? Matteo looked toward the stairs. The estate doctor, a local officer, the old lawyer. Valcourt? Edward asked. No, his father. Of course. Families pass down lawyers the way they pass down silver and infections. Isabel spoke for the first time. Did my father kill her? Matteo looked at her. I don't know. Don't do that, she said. Her voice did not rise. That made it worse. Don't give me cellar fog after 30 years. Matteo looked ruined. I think he let her die, he said. Silence. Edward said, explain. The cradle pin was defective. Everyone knew it. Claire had complained. Auguste delayed repairs because inspectors were coming and he did not want the press room shut down. That night, after the argument, she went down alone to retrieve her notes. The cradle failed. Accident by negligence, Ashcroft said. Matteo shook his head. No. After she was found, the notes were gone. Edward nodded. There it is. Luke said, so father didn't push the barrel, he just removed the reason she was underneath it. Or sent her there, Sophie said quietly. Everyone looked at her. She did not look proud of saying it. Edward asked, what do you know? Sophie's eyes stayed on the red bottle. I was 11, she said. Charles was 16, Luke was 4, Isabel wasn't in the house that week. I was never in the house when it mattered, Isabel said. Sophie flinched, but continued. I remember father burning papers in the courtyard stove the next morning. Charles asked if it was about Claire. Father slapped him. Charles never asked again. Luke stared at her. You never told me that. You were 4. You also drank. Children, please, Edward said. Your brother is dead, and your family history is currently competing with a landfill. Luke looked at him. That was almost tender. It wasn't. Ashcroft gave Edward the faintest look of professional despair. Edward ignored it and turned back to Matteo. The red bottle was Claire's last blend. Why would Auguste include it? Matteo's answer came slowly. To admit she had been right. No, Edward said. Matteo blinked. Then why? Auguste did not build this riddle for confession. He built it for accusation. Each bottle points at a child's sin or a family lie. Black for the original myth, gold for Charles and export fraud, white for Sophie's curated marketing deception, blue for Luke's stolen bottle, green for the true vintage and the cork wound, red for blood inside the house. Isabel said, for me. Edward looked at her. No, for your mother. She held his gaze. That hurt more, but it was cleaner. The red bottle exposes the oldest death, the one that made all the later lies possible. Ashcroft said, and Charles died before anyone got there. Yes. Because he chose gold. Yes. Because someone prepared gold for him. Yes. Sophie looked at Edward. You said chapter... She stopped, frowned at herself. You said someone used a cork. I did. Then who wanted Charles dead? Edward looked at the gold bottle. Someone who knew Charles would choose gold. Someone with access after Auguste's arrangement. Someone who understood corks well enough to prepare a controlled fracture. Someone who wanted the riddle stopped before red or green became public. Luke said, that sounds like half the family and one very depressed winemaker. Matteo looked at him. Careful. Luke raised both hands. I am. It's new. I hate it. Edward turned towards Ashcroft. Where is Valcourt? The lawyer? Upstairs. Bring him down. Ashcroft nodded to an officer. Matteo stiffened. Edward noticed. Problem? No. Matteo. The winemaker closed his mouth. Isabel turned to him. What did Valcourt know? Matteo said, enough. Edward sighed. Everyone in this house uses enough like a wine note. Be specific. Matteo looked toward the stairs. Valcourt's father handled the accident report. Etienne inherited the archive. Auguste trusted him because his father had already helped to bury Claire. And the will? Etienne drafted it. So he knew the riddle. Not all of it, but enough to know the bottles mattered. Could he access the cellar? With the lawyer's key. Ashcroft said, he held one of the two keys. Yes, Edward said, and Mateo held the other. Mateo's face tightened. Meaning? Meaning the official lock was theater. Any two men with old loyalty could enter. Anyone with borrowed keys could pretend he hadn't. Luke looked at the red bottle. Belcourt wouldn't kill Charles. Sophie snapped. You don't know that. No, I mean, he wouldn't dirty his own hands. He'd bill the cork. Edward almost smiled. Not bad. The officer returned with Etienne Valcourt. The lawyer came down the cellar stairs as if every step had been mentioned unfavorably in a contract. He was in his 60s, dry, narrow, with silver hair and a black suit that made him look less like a lawyer than a folded document. He stopped when he saw everyone gathered near the niche. This is highly irregular, he said. Ashcroft looked at him. People keep dying in your client's cellar. We've relaxed the format. Valcourt's eyes moved toward Edward. And you are? Tired of inheritance theater. Luke murmured, aren't we all? Edward pointed to the red bottle. Claire Moreau. Valcourt's face did not change enough. Good. You know that name, Edward said. I know many names. No, you know that one carefully. Valcourt folded his hands. Claire Moreau was a tragic accident in the estate's history. Was she? That was the finding. Your father helped produce that finding. My father was legal counsel to the estate, and legal counsel to the lie. Valcourt's eyes cooled. I would advise restraint. I would advise better family archives. Ashcroft stepped closer. Mr. Belcourt, you held one cellar key. Yes. Matteo Rinaldi held the other. Yes. Who had access to your key after Augustus' final illness? No one without my knowledge. Edward said. That isn't no one. Belcourt looked at him. No. Good. A lawyer who knew when wording had become a trap. Did Sophie take Matteo's key 2 nights ago? Edward asked. Belcourt glanced at Sophie. I was not aware. Did Luke enter after her? No. Did you enter? Belcourt paused. There it was. Yes, he said. When? Yesterday afternoon. Why? To confirm the bottles were present before the will reading.
Alone? Yes. With both keys? With Mr. Rinaldi's permission. Matteo turned sharply. I did not give... Valcourt cut him off. You left your key in the office cabinet. August's instruction allowed counsel to verify the archive. Matteo stepped forward. That is not permission. It is access. Edward looked between them. The room had finally begun telling the truth through technicalities. Edward asked, Did you touch the gold bottle? No. Did you touch any bottle? Yes. Which? Red. Isabel went still. Why? Edward asked. Valcourt's answer was careful. It was out of alignment. Edward stared at him for 1 second, then said, That is the most lawyerly murder room sentence I've heard all week. I did not murder anyone. I didn't say you did, yet. Ashcroft asked, Why was red bottle out of alignment? Valcourt looked at Auguste's niche. I do not know. Edward said, Because someone had moved it before you. Valcourt did not answer. Edward stepped toward him. You came to check whether Auguste's riddle would expose your father's old work. That is absurd. No, absurd is a dead winemaker writing Ask the Cork and expecting his children to become competent overnight. This is ordinary. Valcourt's face hardened. Auguste was ill, bitter, and theatrical. He wished to torment his children, that is all. No, Isabel said. Everyone looked at her. She stepped closer to Valcourt. My mother died in this house. Your father helped call it an accident. Valcourt's expression remained composed, but his eyes changed. Ms. Moreau. Don't, she said. Don't use the polite voice. I've had it used on me since I was old enough to know it meant get out. Valcourt said nothing. Edward let the silence work. Then he asked, Did Charles know about Claire? Valcourt's gaze moved, only slightly, to Sophie. Interesting. Sophie looked stunned. No, she said. Edward turned to her. What? Charles knew, she said. He knew. That's why father slapped him when I was a child. Luke whispered, Oh, this family just keeps giving. Edward said, Charles knew enough to be dangerous. Valcourt said,
Charles knew fragments. Fragments are enough if inherited by an arrogant man. The lawyer said nothing. Edward continued. If the riddle reached red, it would expose Claire's death. If it reached green, it would expose the true vintage. If it reached black, the myth. But Charles chose gold first. Gold exposed his export fraud. He died before the rest of the cellar could speak. Ashcroft said, so whoever killed Charles stopped his secret, but also stopped the riddle. Yes. Who benefits most? Valcourt looked at her. Everyone. Edward shook his head. No, everyone benefits from the riddle failing, but only one person benefits from Charles dying specifically before he can identify someone else. He turned back to the gold cork evidence bag. Charles's last word was gold, not poison, not a name. Gold. He died thinking of the bottle that represented him. Luke said, Very Charles. Exactly, Edward said. The killer counted on that. Charles would choose himself first, always. He looked at Valcourt. You prepared the will. You knew Auguste had arranged accusations by color. Valcourt said nothing. You entered yesterday, alone. You touched red because red frightened you, but gold killed Charles. Still silence. Edward stepped closer. You did not poison gold. Valcourt's face shifted. Sophie blinked. Ashcroft said, No? No, Edward said. He's too careful. If Valcourt wanted the riddle stopped, he would challenge capacity, seal the cellar, produce a procedural delay, or make the bottles inadmissible to inheritance. He would not trust Charles's fingers. Luke looked almost disappointed. So who did? Edward turned to Matteo. The winemaker looked back. Old grief, old loyalty, old rage. Isabel whispered, No. Edward said nothing. Matteo's hands closed. Edward asked quietly, How long have you known Charles helped maintain the Black Harvest fraud? Matteo's voice was hoarse. Years. How long have you known he knew about Claire? No answer. Matteo. The winemaker looked at Isabel, and there was a confession before words. He found the old notes, Charles did. He found them in Auguste's private archive 5 years ago. What did he do? Use them. Against whom? Auguste, Sophie, Luke, Valcourt. Matteo's eyes lowered. Me. And Isabel? He didn't tell her. Why? Because the truth would have given her claim. There it was. The estate, the bottle, the mother, the daughter who belonged more deeply than the legitimate heirs wanted to admit. Edward said, Charles would inherit if he chose gold and suppressed the rest. Yes. But if the riddle continued to red, Isabel might gain evidence that Auguste concealed her mother's death. Yes, and perhaps a legal claim. Valcourt said sharply, That is speculative. Edward looked at him. You would know. Valcourt shut his mouth. Edward turned back to Matteo. You poisoned the gold cork. Isabel said, No, not the Nile. Plea. Matteo's face broke. Only a little, but enough. No, he said. Edward waited. Matteo repeated, quieter, No. Then say why the gold cork carried poison on the inner fracture. I don't know. You do. I prepared the bottles as Auguste ordered. I weakened the gold cork. Yes. The cellar froze. Ashcroft stepped closer. You weakened it? Yes. Why? Because Auguste wanted Charles to see the false age. The cork would break and reveal the new interior. It was meant to humiliate him. Edward nodded. That part fit. But you didn't add poison. No. Who knew the cork was weakened? Auguste. He is dead. Yes. You? Yes. Anyone else? Matteo looked at Valcourt. Valcourt's face had gone very still. Ah. Edward turned slowly. You knew. Valcourt said nothing. You knew the gold cork was designed to break. Still nothing. Because Auguste documented the mechanism in the will file. Valcourt's silence became answer, Edward said. And you entered yesterday. Ashcroft looked between them. Wait, you said he didn't poison it. I said too early, Edward replied. That was rude of me. Luke muttered, finally, personal growth. Edward ignored him. Valcourt looked at Matteo with something like contempt. You fool. Matteo moved, but Ashcroft raised a hand. Edward stepped in. No, not fool, tool. There's a difference lawyers appreciate. Matteo prepared the false cork under Augustine's instruction. You knew it would break. You knew Charles would choose gold. You knew Charles would handle the broken cork because Augustine's line told them to ask it. So you added poison to the inner fracture yesterday. Valcourt's voice was dry. That is an elaborate fantasy. No, it's quite simple. You were afraid of red. Valcourt's face did not move. You touched red because you checked whether Augustine had placed Claire's bottle in the riddle. He had. If red was opened, your father's role in the old accident would return. Your firm's legacy, your liability, your family's service to the Varens, all of it would become part of the same fraud. Ashcroft said, and killing Charles stopped the riddle? Edward nodded. More importantly, it placed the first scandal on Charles. Gold, export fraud, poison, dead air. The family would fight over Charles, not Claire. Red would remain unopened. Valcourt looked almost amused now. You cannot prove I added anything. Edward pointed to his cuffs. You touched red. Yes. You said it was out of alignment. Yes. Then you handled the niche. Yes. You entered yesterday with no gloves. Valcourt hesitated. There. Edward smiled faintly. Oh. Ashcroft said, what? Edward looked at the red wax. Search his office, now, specifically for cellar gloves, wax residue, and any compound compatible with the gold cork. Valcourt said, you will need a warrant. Ashcroft smiled. Dead air, admitted cellar entry, controlled evidence, and suspected poisoning. I'll try to survive the paperwork. Valcourt's jaw tightened. Edward stepped closer to the lawyer. But that won't be the first proof. No. The proof is in the red bottle. Valcourt went still. Everyone did. Edward turned to Matteo. Open red. Valcourt snapped. You cannot. Ashcroft said, careful, Mr. Valcourt. Edward looked at Matteo. Open it. Matteo's hands trembled. Not from age, from 30 years arriving at once. He took the red bottle, cut the wax, drew the cork. It came out slowly, intact, dark with age. Embedded in the side of the cork beneath the wax line was a tiny strip of oilskin. A note. Matteo closed his eyes. Isabel covered her mouth. Edward said, Augustine always did enjoy performance. Ashcroft took the note with gloves, unfolded it under the lamp, and read aloud. Claire did not fall because the cradle failed. She went below because I sent her there. I did not kill her with my hands. I killed her with delay, fear, and profit. Valcourt knew. His father knew. Charles knew enough to sell silence. Whoever stops this bottle from speaking proves the house has learned nothing. The cellar did not breathe. Then Luke said softly, bloody hell. No one corrected him. Edward looked at Valcourt. The lawyer's face had lost color. Not because the note convicted him of Charles's murder directly, because it explained why Charles had to die before red was opened. Ashcroft said, Etienne Valcourt, you're not leaving the cellar. Valcourt said nothing. He was looking at the red cork, at the dead woman's bottle, at the note he had tried to keep sealed. Edward turned to Isabel. She was crying now, but silently, not broken, just finally given the shape of a wound everyone called weather. Matteo stood beside her, holding the open red bottle like a relic or a crime. Edward looked at the 6 colors one last time. Black for the myth, gold for greed, white for the brand, blue for theft, green for truth, red for blood. Auguste Véron had not left an inheritance puzzle. He had left a cellar full of indictments, and someone had killed the first heir arrogant enough to open the wrong one. Chapter 5. The Last Vintage. By 4 a.m, the Véron cellar had stopped looking like a wine archive and started looking like a courtroom with mold. Edward Hale preferred it that way. Courtrooms were designed to make lies sound structured. Cellars had no such manners. Stones sweated. Corks cracked. Dust settled where hands could not improve it. The old bottles lay under police lamps now, their colors no longer decorative, but accusatory. Black, red, green, white, gold, blue. 6 bottles, 6 family sins, 1 dead heir on the stone floor. Etienne Valcourt stood near the tasting table with his hands folded in front of him, pale but composed again. Lawyers recovered faster than honest people. That was not strength, that was training. Matteo Rinaldi stood beside the opened red bottle, looking like a man who had waited 30 years for the truth and now hated its punctuality. Isabelle Moreau had not moved far from him. Sophie stood by the barrel row, arms crossed. Luke sat on an empty crate, elbows on knees, suddenly stripped of jokes. Ashcroft held the oilskin note in an evidence sleeve. Claire did not fall because the cradle failed. She went below because I sent her there. I did not kill her with my hands. I killed her with delay, fear, and profit. Valcourt knew. His father knew. Charles knew enough to sell silence. Whoever stops this bottle from speaking proves the house has learned nothing. Edward looked at Valcourt. Auguste gave you a problem, he said. Valcourt's voice remained dry. Auguste gave everyone problems. It was his preferred form of estate planning. Yes, but yours was special. Valcourt said nothing. Edward walked to the 6-bottle layout. Auguste built the riddle as a delayed confession, not a moral one. He was too vain for clean morality. He wanted control after death. He wanted the children to expose themselves by choosing the bottle that flattered their sin. He pointed to black. Black, the public myth, the legendary black harvest. Then white. White, marketing polish, Sophie's department. Blue, blue, the charity auction line Luke stole from. Gold, gold, export archive, Charles's territory. Green, green, the true damaged vintage, the cork with the wound. Finally, red, red, blood inside the house, Claire Moreau. Isabel's face tightened at the name, but she did not look away. Edward continued. Charles would choose gold. Everyone says that, because everyone knew Charles. He was greedy in the least imaginative way available to an eldest son. He believed the estate already belonged to him and expected the bottle to agree. Luke murmured, "It usually did." Edward ignored him. Auguste and Matteo prepared gold to humiliate Charles. The cork was weakened. It would break during opening and reveal that the bottle had been dressed to look old. Charles would handle the broken cork, because men like Charles require objects to confess before they do. Valcourt said, "This is colorful." No, the bottles are colorful. The murder is plain. Ashcroft almost smiled. Edward stepped closer to the lawyer. You entered the cellar yesterday. You had access with the lawyer's key. You knew from Auguste's file that the gold cork had been prepared to break. You also knew that if the red bottle was opened, your father's role in Claire's death would return. Valcourt looked at the red bottle. My father is dead. So was Claire. You still found her inconvenient. Valcourt's eyes hardened. Edward continued. You didn't need to poison the wine. Too risky. Too much testing. Too many people might drink. You poisoned the inner fracture of the prepared gold cork. Charles would touch it after it broke. He did. Then he drank from the same hand. Ashcroft added, Lab has already found oily residue on the gold cork fracture, preliminary compound consistent with the toxin in Charles Veyron's blood. Valcourt looked at her. Preliminary. Yes, a word guilty people love until final arrives. Luke quietly said, that was rather good.
Sophie snapped. Luke, what? We're allowed to appreciate form? Edward looked at Valcourt again. You counted on confusion. Everyone would ask which bottle was poisoned. They would argue about gold, inheritance, Charles, export fraud. The red bottle would remain sealed long enough for legal intervention. Capacity challenge, procedural freeze, estate preservation, whatever phrase you plan to use before breakfast. Valcourt said, if I wished to stop the riddle, I could have done so legally. Yes, Edward said, you tried. Auguste anticipated you. For the first time, Valcourt's composure thinned. Edward pointed to the red note. Whoever stops this bottle from speaking proves the house has learned nothing. Silence. That line was for you, Edward said. Auguste knew legal obstruction would look like guilt. If you challenged the riddle before the family opened the cellar, you would draw attention to red. So you did something faster. You killed Charles with his own arrogance and tried to make the family stop at gold. Valcourt's voice lowered. Charles was a vindictive old drunk. Yes. He used everyone. Yes. He let Claire die and decided confession mattered only when it could be staged. Yes. Edward stepped closer. And you still murdered Charles. Valcourt's face went flat. No more polite evasion. Good. There was a man under the office. Charles was already using the old records, Valcourt said. Ashcroft's pen stopped. Edward did not move. He found fragments. He intended to use them after inheriting, against the firm, against Sophie, against Isabel if she became troublesome, against anyone. Sophie whispered, "Of course he did." Valcourt looked at her. "Your brother was not a victim of noble inheritance. He was a blackmailer with better tailoring." "Still dead," Ashcroft said. Valcourt turned to her. "Many dead people are not losses to civilization." "No, but killing them remains administratively frowned upon." Luke looked at Edward. "I like her," Edward said. "Focus." He turned back to Valcourt. "You knew Charles would open gold first. You killed him before he could use red." "I protected my firm." "No," Edward said. "You protected the inherited profession of bearing Veyron bodies under legal vocabulary." That landed. Valcourt did not answer. He did not need to. Ashcroft stepped forward. "Etienne Valcourt, you're under arrest on suspicion of murder." Valcourt looked at the bottles one last time. Not at gold, at red. Then he said, almost softly, "Your father should have burned that bottle." Isabel answered before anyone else could. "He should have opened it." Valcourt looked at her. For once, he had no correction. Ashcroft led him toward the stairs. Halfway up, Luke called after him. "Do we still bill the estate for this, or is murder included in the retainer?" Sophie closed her eyes. "Luke, for God's sake." "What? Charles would have laughed." "No," Isabel said quietly. "Charles would have charged him interest." For one fragile second, the cellar almost breathed like a living room. Then the moment passed. Charles was still dead, Claire was still dead, Auguste was still a bastard with posthumous handwriting, and the Veyron estate was still full of bottles that had spent decades doing what people would not, holding their contents. Matteo opened the green bottle after sunrise, not for inheritance, for proof. Ashcroft protested for 20 seconds. Edward let her. Matteo argued for 30. Isabel said nothing. In the end, procedure bent under the weight of Auguste's note, a forensic camera, and the fact that everyone in the cellar was too tired to respect ceremony. The green wax cracked unevenly. The cork emerged slowly. Along one side, cut into the cork and darkened by time, was a narrow scar, a wound. Matteo held it under the light. "There," he said. His voice broke on the word. Isabel leaned close. The old cork smelled of damp earth, wine, and survival. Not romance, not market value, survival. "The last true vintage," Edward said. Matteo nodded. "Yes." Sophie stared at it. "All this for one honest bottle?" "No," Edward said. "All this because one honest bottle was less profitable than 1,000 dishonest ones." Luke stood up. "That should be on the label." Sophie gave him a look. "What, too soon?" "Yes. By family standards, 30 years too late." No one argued. Edward looked at Isabel. "Auguste intended you to find green." She shook her head. "No, he intended me to find red." Edward considered her. Yes, the distinction mattered. Green was the wine truth. Red was the human truth. Families like Veyron always confused the two because bottles were easier to value than women crushed on their machinery and paperwork. Sophie said, "Who inherits now?" The question sounded ugly. It was also inevitable. Luke said, "Wonderful. Body still metaphorically warm, and we're back to shares." Sophie turned on him. "Do you want to run this estate?" "God, no." "Then be useful and shut up." Edward looked at Ashcroft. "I'm leaving before succession law lowers the room temperature further." Ashcroft nodded. "I'll need statements from all of them. You'll need a priest, 3 accountants, a fraud investigator, and someone with experience handling rich grief. Any recommendations?" "No, I avoid such people for medical reasons." He moved toward the stairs. Isabel followed him part way. "Mr. Hale." He stopped. She held the green cork in its evident sleeve, not touching it directly. "Was my father trying to make things right?" Edward looked back at the red bottle. No. The answer hurt her. He did not soften it. He was trying to control how wrong he had been. Different thing. She nodded slowly. "And my mother?" She was right too early. Families punish that. Isabel looked down. For a moment, she seemed both older and younger than she had all night. What happens to the estate? Legally, chaos. And honestly? Edward looked at the cellar. And honestly, it has been chaos for 30 years. Now it has inventory. That almost made her smile. Almost.
He continued up the stairs. Behind him, Matteo recorked green for evidence. Sophie spoke quietly into her phone, already containing disaster. Luke opened his mouth, thought better of it, and closed it again, which proved even he could grow under pressure if the pressure involved murder and wine fraud. At the top of the stairs, Edward paused and looked back once. The cellar remained below, cold and damp and finally awake. Black for myth, gold for greed, white for polish, blue for theft, green for truth, red for blood. Auguste Véran had wanted his children to ask the cork. Edward suspected the cork had been waiting years to answer. People lie better than bottles, but not forever. Epilogue: The bottle that remembered. By noon, the Véran estate had stopped pretending Charles Véran was the only problem. That was progress. Not moral progress. Families like the Vérans did not move that quickly. This was administrative progress, which meant lawyers had begun using longer sentences, phones were being answered in private rooms, and the first official statement was delayed because every draft accidentally admitted something. The vineyard looked almost peaceful in daylight. That was offensive. The storm had passed before dawn, leaving the slopes washed clean under a pale sky. Water clung to the vine wires, the rows ran down toward the valley in perfect lines. From a distance, the estate looked like a painting on an expensive restaurant wall. Stone house, cypress trees, wet leaves, old wine, inherited patience. From inside, it looked like evidence. Police moved through the house with boxes. Accountants arrived just after 10. A fraud investigator came before lunch and immediately asked for coffee strong enough to qualify as an industrial solvent. By 11, 3 export archives had been sealed. By 11:30, Sophie had stopped saying brand damage and started saying criminal exposure, which Edward Hale considered a sign of professional adaptation. At the end, Valcourt had been taken away shortly after sunrise. He had said very little. That was wise. Lawyers knew the value of silence the way cellarmen knew humidity. But the gold cork had spoken enough for him. The residue on the inner fracture matched the toxin in Charles' blood. Valcourt's gloves were later found in his estate office fireplace, badly burned but still carrying traces of wax and the same oily carrier. In his briefcase, officers found copied pages from Auguste's sealed instruction file describing the prepared gold cork. Not the poison, just the mechanism. That was enough. Valcourt took Auguste's humiliating little trap and improved it into murder. That Edward found typical of professionals who spend their lives near rich families. They rarely created the rot. They learned how to use it. Charles Véran's death remained ugly, but it was no longer mysterious. He chose gold because gold belonged to him. Export, prestige, control. The public-facing archive samples that had carried the Black Harvest legend into restaurants, auctions, and private cellars, where men paid absurd sums to taste a story more than a wine. The gold bottle was false. Auguste intended the cork to break and reveal it. Charles, being Charles, handled the broken cork like a prosecutor holding proof. The poison on the inner fracture had passed from cork to fingers, from fingers to glass, from glass to mouth. A stupid death in one sense, a precise death in another. Murder often looked stupid once solved. That's why murderers prefer mystery. It flattered them. Valcourt had counted on the family doing what families like that always did, arguing about ownership before asking what the dead man had touched. He counted on gold absorbing attention. Charles's greed, Sophie's panic, Luke's theft, Matteo's silence, all of it made enough noise to keep the red bottle sealed. But old bottles had patience. The red one waited. When opened, it had done what dead women were rarely allowed to do in houses like that. It spoke. Claire Moreau's note changed the estate more than Charles's body did. That was the interesting part. A living heir poisoned in front of witnesses brought police. A dead woman named properly after 30 years brought history. The old accident file was reopened. The press room was sealed. The cradle mechanism, long replaced, was traced through maintenance logs and old insurance photographs. Matteo gave a full statement. Sophie added the memory of Auguste burning papers the morning after Claire's death. Luke, to everyone's surprise and his own visible discomfort, found 2 letters from Auguste in an old desk drawer that confirmed Claire had threatened to expose the Black Harvest fraud days before she died. Isabel did not cry when Ashcroft told her. She had cried in the cellar, in front of the red bottle. After that, the grief seemed to have become structural. She listened. She asked exact questions. She corrected dates. She demanded copies. She did not once ask whether Auguste loved her mother. Edward approved.
That question was usually a trap. Men like Auguste could love someone and still destroy her if destruction preserved the house. Calling that contradiction human did not make it less criminal. It only made people too polite around it. The green bottle became the center of the legal fight by afternoon. Naturally, the last true vintage, the bottle that carried the wound. The cork scar cut from the damaged north parcel, the one small honest batch from the Black Harvest year. Matteo had held that cork like a relic. Sophie had stared at it like a lawsuit. Luke had asked whether anyone else suddenly wanted to drink something cheap and anonymous. No one laughed. Well, Edward almost did. Almost. The green bottle was not worth as much as the fake Black Harvest myth. That was the joke. The actual wine was rare, yes. Historically important, yes. But it was not the legend collectors had bought. It was lean, damaged, difficult, probably brilliant in the way a scar could be brilliant if one had the bad taste to appraise suffering. The market would hate it at first, then exploit it. Markets were sentimental only after pricing the corpse. Sophie understood that before anyone. By 2 o'clock, she had already begun sketching the shape of the salvage campaign in her head. Edward could see it happening behind her eyes. The truth of the Black Harvest, the wine that survived the lie, Claire Moreau's last legacy. He told her not to. She looked at him. Not to what? Whatever title you just wrote in your skull. Sophie's mouth opened, then closed. Luke, sitting on the windowsill with a coffee he had ruined with brandy, whispered, "He's good." Sophie ignored him. Edward said, "Your first useful act as a human being would be to leave Claire Moreau out of your campaign decks." Her face hardened. "This estate still has workers, contracts, debts, and a murdered brother." "Yes. And if the brand collapses completely, dozens of people suffer." "Also yes. So forgive me if moral purity seems less practical than employment." Edward looked at her for a moment. "Do not confuse restraint with purity. Use the fraud. Use Auguste. Use Charles if you must. He would have used you. But do not turn Claire into a label before her daughter is finished learning how she died." That struck. Harder than Sophie wanted. "Good." She looked towards Isabel, who stood at the far end of the room speaking quietly with Ashcroft. "I'm not a monster," Sophie said. "No, you're worse in some ways. You're adaptable." Luke made a small sound. Sophie gave him a murderous look. He lifted both hands. "I didn't say it. I merely enjoyed it." Matteo found Edward in the cellar near sunset. By then, the estate had entered the exhausted stage after revelation. Not quieter exactly, but stripped. Servants no longer moved like ghosts. Lawyers no longer spoke as if grammar could disinfect crime. The surviving heirs had retreated into separate rooms, each with their own version of inheritance and damage. Edward had gone back down to the cellar because the place was better company. Matteo stood beside the north niche. The 6 bottles were gone now, secured as evidence or sealed under official supervision. Only the empty stone recess remained. Without them, the niche looked smaller, less mythical, more like a hole in a wall. Matteo said, "I helped him." Edward did not turn. "Auguste?" "Yes." "With the riddle?" "Yes." "With the Black Harvest lie?" Matteo was silent. That answered. Edward looked at him. "How much?" "Enough." "No." Matteo exhaled slowly. "I was young. Claire was already dead. The estate was drowning. Auguste said the lie had already been born and only fools abandon a child after feeding it." He gave a bitter little smile. He could make cowardice sound like stewardship. Most patriarchs can. Matteo leaned against the stone wall. "I recorked some bottles, moved records. Later I told myself I preserved the estate because workers depended on it." "Did they?" "Yes." "Did that make it clean?" "No." "Good. That was at least the beginning." Matteo leaned against the stone wall. "Claire knew before any of us. She said false wine would teach the family to prefer false everything." Edward looked at the empty niche. "She was right. Yes. Families punish that." "Isabel said you told her that." "I did." Matteo nodded. "She has her mother's eyes." "That is rarely useful information." "It is to me." Edward let that pass. Sentiment in controlled doses did not always damage evidence. Matteo said, "Will Isabel inherit?" "No idea." "You are not curious?"
I am curious. I am also not stupid enough to predict inheritance after murder, fraud, illegitimacy, and 30 years of forged wine. Mateo almost smiled. Fair. He looked at the niche again. Auguste wanted her to find red. Yes. And green? He wanted everyone to find green. He wanted the estate to know the difference between the true vintage and the profitable one. Mateo shook his head. He was too late. Yes. That matters? It always matters. The winemaker closed his eyes. I should have told her years ago. Yes. She would have hated me. Yes. She may still. Probably. Mateo opened his eyes. You are not comforting. No, comfort is what people ask for when consequences arrive without manners. The old winemaker looked at him, then laughed once, quietly, painfully, but genuinely. Isabel came to the cellar after Mateo left. Edward had expected that. Some people flee the room where truth appears. Others return because they want to see whether it remains. She stood at the bottom of the steps, looking at the empty niche. They took them. Yes. Even red? Yes. Good. She came closer. I thought I would want to keep it. You don't? No. Good. Better than good. A relic could become another prison if handled by the wrong grief. She touched the stone wall beside the niche. Not dramatically, just once. My mother made wine that no one remembers tasting. Edward said nothing. They remember the lie, the critics, the auctions, the black harvest, but not her. Now they will. She looked at him. Because of the scandal. Yes, that's ugly. Yes, but better than nothing? Edward considered. Not better, different. Nothing is clean here. She nodded slowly. I keep wanting a clean fact. You have one. What? Claire was right. Isabel looked away. For a moment, her face nearly broke again. Then she recovered. Yes, she said, she was. They stood in silence. Above them, faintly, came the sound of doors closing, people moving, a house learning new lies to survive the old ones. Isabel said, what happens to families after this? Usually? Yes. They split into factions, hire lawyers, leak selectively, blame the dead, protect whatever still produces money, and eventually agree that healing requires no one mention the most accurate parts at dinner. She looked at him. And this family? That was this family. For the first time all night, Isabel smiled properly. Not happily, properly. I supposed I asked for that. You did. She looked at the niche again. Auguste wanted control. Yes. Charles wanted ownership. Yes. Sophie wants survival. Yes. Luke wants escape. Mostly. Mateo wants forgiveness. Yes. And me? Edward looked at her. You want the cellar to stop lying before you decide whether to stay in the house above it. She absorbed that, then nodded. Accurate. Rarely comfortable. I noticed. She started up the stairs, then stopped. Mr. Hale. Yes. Was green really the last true vintage? Yes. And red. Red was the bottle that remembered why truth had been buried. She thought about that, then said, that sounds like something my father would have said if he wanted applause. Then forget I said it. This time she almost laughed. She went upstairs. Edward stayed a little longer. The cellar was empty now, but not silent. No cellar was silent if one knew what had been stored there. The Veyron fraud became public in stages. First came Charles's death, then the arrest of Etienne Valcourt, then the reopened investigation into Claire Moreau, then, inevitably, the Black Harvest scandal. Collectors threatened lawsuits. Importers demanded refunds with the wounded dignity of people who had paid fortunes to be deceived tastefully. Critics began rewriting old praise as contextual enthusiasm, which Edward found almost admirable in its cowardice. Auction houses removed Veyron lots pending authentication. 3 restaurants quietly pulled the Black Harvest from their reserve lists and pretended they had never charged more than a car for it. The estate survived the first week. That surprised people who did not understand vineyards. Vineyards survived almost anything except neglect, weather, and heirs. The workers stayed. The vines did not care about scandal. The barrels continued aging with professional indifference. Fermentation had no respect for public relations. Sophie did not launch the campaign Edward had feared. Not immediately. That counted as restraint in her world, and perhaps sainthood in marketing. Luke entered a treatment clinic in Marseille and checked himself out after 12 hours, then checked himself back in after Isabel told him he had become boring. Edward admired her efficiency. Mateo gave testimony. Full testimony. Not clean, not heroic, but full. Isabel remained at the estate, for now. 3 weeks later, a small package arrived at Edward's office. No note. Inside was a cork in a sealed glass case. Not evidence, not from the police file. A harmless duplicate cut from a later barrel sample, marked with a thin scar along one side. Under it, on a small card, Isabel had written, "For when people say bottles cannot testify." Edward looked at it for a long moment, then placed it on the shelf behind his desk, between a cracked chess piece from another case and a fountain pen that once belonged to a dead blackmailer. Ashcroft saw it the next day.
What's that? A witness. She looked at the cork. I hate that I understand what you mean. Professional growth. Don't. He didn't. She handed him a file. New case. Already? People remain disappointing. That is the only reliable industry. Ashcroft glanced once more at the cork. Did the estate decide inheritance? Not yet. Who do you think gets it? Edward looked out the window. Legally, I don't know. Morally, the vines. Ashcroft sighed. You're insufferable when rural. I'm insufferable everywhere. Yes, but usually with better shoes. He opened the file. Before reading, he looked one last time at Isabel's cork. The last true vintage had not been the most expensive bottle, it had not been the rarest, it had not been the one praised by fools or sold by liars. It had been the one that still carried the wound. That was the part Auguste had understood too late. Truth was not valuable because it was clean. It was valuable because it remained, even after everyone profitable had tried to improve it. Edward turned the first page of the new file. Outside, the city moved through afternoon rain. Somewhere, far south, in an old cellar beneath a vineyard, empty stone waited where 6 bottles had once lain. The black bottle had held the myth. The gold had held greed. The white had held polish. The blue had held theft. The green had held truth. The red had held blood. And the corks, after all those years, had finally answered.
The last true vintage was not the most expensive bottle, not the rarest, not the one praised by collectors, not the one sold by liars. It was the bottle that still carried the wound. If you enjoy modern detective stories in the spirit of Sherlock Holmes, subscribe to the channel. The next case is already waiting.